The budget cycle. This lesson is presented by Kelly McGarry. Kelly is a former budget analyst for the city of Fremont, California, and later spent more than a decade as a public finance analyst for Standard & Poor's and Fitch Ratings. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the fiscal structure of a government budget. You'll know who is involved in developing the budget. You'll have an understanding of the budget cycle timeline, and we'll teach you strategies to read budget documents and identify business opportunities.
What you're going to see is that government budgeting, it is very structured. It has to be. It's legislated. It's sort of documented, and people are looking for government sometimes to make mistakes. So for all of those reasons, it stays very structured. The budget, it's legal authority for governments to spend their money that they receive. And we'll talk a little bit more about those revenue sources in the next few slides. It allocates those resources. You can't use every dollar that comes into a government for everything. If you receive revenue from a sales tax, for example, that was designated only for capital projects or for infrastructure, you can't use those dollars to pay a police officer's salary. And those distinctions become really important as a government looks at the revenues coming in and sort of the demands or the requirements, funding requirements on the way out. Again, of course, it's going to reflect the government's priorities and their policies. We'll talk a little bit about who's setting those priorities and policies. That's another fun part of local government and the folks who make those really meaningful decisions. A very useful part of the budget process is the incorporation of longer-term mission statements of a government, goals, objectives. From my perspective, when I was finished working in local government, I started the longest part of my career working for Standard & Poor's initially. So I worked for bond rating agencies for about 15 years in the municipal sector. And we would often say on our side of the table, and what bond analysts do, I'm not sure if you know, let's say this city, this is a fun example, city of Miami, I lived this and I was subpoenaed by the SEC for this. So super fun story, not so much, but I was fine. City of Miami wants to build a baseball stadium. They don't have $500 million available in the bank, so they have to float bonds to fund that project and then repay it over time. It's the mortgage of the municipal sector. So as a bond analyst, the role of analysts at Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch is to evaluate the willingness and ability for those entities to repay bondholders, to pay back their debt. So we do all sorts of things to arrive at a conclusion. And you've probably heard that bonds can be rated AAA, the very best, well into lower investment grade and non-investment grade categories. Some call it the grade. It's the grade of the government. Elected officials are very much focused on those bond ratings, so they think it's a complete reflection of what they do, which is not necessarily, or it's often not at all true. And of course, it sets interest rates. It also tells banks, the level of risk that they're taking on when they loan money to this entity. And the reason for me saying that is I would often say I could look at a budget document and have a very, very good idea of what that credit rating was going to be without talking to anybody. A well-written budget document, for better or for worse, tells the story. It demonstrates good fiscal management, risky fiscal management, all of those things. So I'll get a little bit more into that and how those strategic plans and mission statements can really give you a better sense of what the government's trying to do and be sort of further back on the runway of opportunity. Okay, mention this briefly. Governments run programs at the very highest level. They have an operating budget. The very, very largest component of any government's operating budget is payroll, salaries, and benefits. I have worked with the city of Tampa in the last 6 months, and their operating budget takes up 80% of general governmental operating revenue. 8 out of every $10 pays people and pays for benefits. Leaves 20% for the rest. When you think about it in that those magnitudes, you can see where they're competing for dollars. And then there's the capital budget. It's just what it says it is. Those are large budgets that programmed monies to be spent on infrastructure. It can be very large projects, roadways, bridges, tunnels. Also can also be, computers for all staff. I mean, it runs the gamut. Revenue sources for the operating budget are generally different than revenue sources from the capital budget. So let's say the operating budget, those revenue sources coming in, which for local governments, especially municipalities, will be largely property taxes, for example. Of those revenues that are that can be used for operations, 80% of those are almost always eaten up by salaries and benefits in the larger cities. The capital budget is entirely different. Revenue sources tend to be different, not exclusively, but just coming from different designated sources. And I don't want to get into the weeds. Some
Sure.
governments who are more sophisticated in their budget processes on the capital side will incorporate operations and then have overhead chargebacks and things like that. But ultimately, it's on the operations. And I'll just say, and I'll get into the cycle a little bit, operating budgets tend to be plan appropriations for 1 year. Some budgets or some entities plan for 2 years, but really at the beginning of that second year, they're almost revisiting it and doing it over. I never understood why governments do it. It's statutory, but for the most part, an operating budget is 1 year. A capital budget, on the other hand, is a great tool because they tend to present a budget document that's a 5-year budget document. It's called the Capital Improvement Program. So you'll see that within the operating budget, very much carved out and obvious. And that plan, that 5-year plan, it will appropriate monies for that first year. So the appropriation will match the operating budget, but you will see the planned spend for 4 years after that. And that's a very useful tool to see where government's spending its money. They haven't even always identified the funding sources for that, but it's sort of partial wish list, partial reality. It's just a great planning tool, and it's useful to look at if you're trying to see where that government's going. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. So who's involved? Different levels of government have different sort of leadership structures. If we talk about a municipality, a city, I'm staying in the city of Tampa. They have a city council. They have department heads. They have various boards and commissions. They have citizens, right? These groups are all involved to some extent in developing a budget, at least in the planning stages. And as a reminder, a city council, which I'm sure you all know, you all live in places where you have probably voted for your local officials. They're elected officials. I've often said in my personal life as a taxpayer and in my professional life as an analyst, and this is no shade meant, but when there's an elected official, it's sort of very up in the air what you're getting. You can have someone who is a skilled professional in the work they're going to be doing, or you could have someone that's doing something completely unrelated. They could be running a restaurant, having done that their whole life. So you don't know who you're talking to and what skill set they're going to have to make the decisions that they have to make, including budgetary decisions. Governmental staff is key in budget development. I would say department heads, and every entity will have different departments, and the folks oversee each of those departments contribute greatly to what that department needs in terms of to be funded in the budget, what that department wants to be funded in that budget, and they'll go to bat for that during this process. Obviously, different departments and interests are fighting for the same money. And examples at the city level of a department would be the building department, the engineering department, the economic development department, the housing and affordable development department. All of these different groups put their hands in the pot, and they frankly try to fund as much as they can, again, with these limited resources.
Coming again from the sort of sales and business development side, something that I've found when you mentioned the department heads, and they are more often than not, that will be the real decision maker that you're selling to. There will be other people who have to sign for sure, but by and large, whoever's running the department you're selling into likely has the authority to designate a portion of their budget to your product, your services, so forth. What I have found in some cases can be helpful is, Kelly mentioned the competing between departments for budget. If you are able to have something that can potentially take funds from or come out of multiple budgets or portions of a budget, you can sometimes get a little further than having to come out of a single department's budget. And there are ways you can do that with different applications of software or things like that. So in my case, I frequently was able to sell geospatial technology by helping governments understand that some of this money could come from public works, some of it might come from the planning department, because there could be multiple applications or uses built off either. And I'm not necessarily telling them how to distribute their funds, but I'm putting them on notice and saying, hey, guess what? You can both benefit. Maybe you should talk and see if you want to split the funds and make it easier. And sometimes you can get a bigger sale that way too.
Okay. I touched on this a little bit. The first point just being it's very structured. It's mandated. It's not a government really couldn't make a decision to say, I'm going to have a 14-month budget, or I'm just going to, on a whim, change the start of a new fiscal year. Doesn't happen. It's very structured. Fiscal year start dates, they do vary quite widely among all public sector entities. With some exceptions, vast majorities of states begin their fiscal years on July 1st, and it's a 12-month fiscal year. Majority of cities, but just over 50% start also on July 1st. But there are other start dates, October 1st, summer start Jan 1. And surprisingly, and somewhat problematic, entities within the same state aren't required to or often don't have the same fiscal year, which creates all sorts of fun when the state is, providing funds for local services, but not really an issue here. They can just start anytime. It's very structured. And I've never heard of an entity changing their fiscal year. I couldn't imagine why they'd want to. So they're pretty set. And it would be important, obviously, to know if you're looking at a potential client to know when that fiscal year is. But we'll talk now that the steps within that budget year, which whether it starts on July 1st or October 1st, the steps in that budget development to budget adoption are very similar for not only sort of whenever the fiscal year starts, but also the different levels of government.
Another thing just to keep in mind here is this can be both a blessing and a curse when you're selling into this sector, because the blessing side is you kind of have this diversified range of budget cycles that you can sort of have money coming in at all different times of the year. I've done work with school districts, which are much more standardized, and that could be problematic because all the money and all the work and everything happens at like one point. It just messes up, utilization and getting bodies to do the work and all these other things. But you can have a really diversified cycle. But what's key is to start to understand what that cycle is. If you're building out a sales team, you need to make sure that your sales team understands that information is critical, that you need to know what it is, because you can't give a message to a city or a county at the wrong time. It just won't be received. Their priorities are other places.
Okay. So this is just at a very high level, what the different sort of segments of the year look like and what actually happens as a budget is being developed. The first bullet here, budget preparation to adoption, typically takes 10 to 12 months. That said, cities sort of elected officials, one of their favorite activities I've often found are these council retreats or commission retreats where they'll go off site, they'll have a facilitator, and then they'll have whiteboards everywhere and sort of facilitate their dreams and wants for their organization. And that almost is always happening before 10 to 12 months. And that's just sort of the preliminary. And I mean, if you ever sit in one of those sessions, it's, I don't know if they're playing the lottery or what, but it's a good brainstorming opportunity. And then the executives, the city manager, sometimes the mayor, can help sort of direct that into a reasonable approach that actually considers the money that's available. So the executive requests, and we're going to talk about sort of the players in this in a little more detail. But when I talk about an executive, it could be the governor at the state level. It could be a city manager at a city level, a mayor, a county, a county administrator. Just sort of the role that is operating or at the top of the org chart for that government. And with the exception of a mayor, a mayor is an elected official, but otherwise it's often a professional. So they're talking to all of their department heads and asking them to provide their budget requests for the year. And at that time, they're also providing them with the revenue estimates that they've received. So a city manager will receive estimates for revenue, whether it's from the state for some particular taxes, whether it's the county for property taxes. So they kind of have a sense of what they're working with. And revenues don't tend to change dramatically from year to year. I mean, obviously, the hope is that they grow. There have been many cycles where they've retracted. Recessionary trends in sales taxes are obviously negative. Lots of governments have policies in place to kind of protect property tax revenue. So that tends to be a little bit more stable. But the executive is talking to the departments, requesting for them to provide what they'd like to be funded for the year. So the departments send their wish list back to the executive, and then that executive and his or her staff are putting together a preliminary budget document. It's a very detailed document. It's a line item budget that assigns a revenue source to every expenditure at the sort of most basic level. Obviously, there's conversation between these groups during this time. It's not like there's one email with a request and a yes or a no. It's I would say largely collaborative among most governments. But at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of revenue that can't fund everything. So it's the competing interests, but they generally know what they're working with. There are public hearings, and that's the hearing line, and that's exceptionally important, I think, in this process. For transparency purposes, though I will say that by the time these budgets are being presented at public hearings, they are largely developed. And there are, I'd say, not a whole lot of meaningful examples where budgets are wildly altered through the public hearing process. So once that happens, it's still going back and forth. They're tweaking every fund, every line item, and they'll ultimately, by the end of the last fiscal year, they're adopting a new budget, presenting it to their community, presenting it to everyone involved. And the best way to look at it is it's at a minimum 12 months before they're starting to think about it. I mentioned those planning sessions. For sure, elected officials are talking about this before that 12 months starts. They're talking about it. It's often documented in their strategic planning documents, but their formalized budget process is starting 10 to 12 months before. And it's simply an exercise of telling departments how much money they have, departments requesting what they want, the executives putting that together in a way that provides services that they've committed to for their community, that serves what they believe is the interest of most. That budget's adopted and it's implemented. And it's very much a live document. The budget's adopted, but it's obviously based on estimates. The revenues, they're estimates. So they revisit that document monthly, they update it. But again, there aren't very meaningful changes outside that final adoption. But this is all very much public information. I would say, and it would be great if there was a tool to see how many, who's accessing what documents on a city's website, for example. But I would guess that the budget document is the most frequently accessed document by citizens on a city or public sector's website because they want to see where their money is going.
And I think the private sector has spoken on this, if not actually spoken, but by some of the tools that have been built in recent years by the tech industry. There are a number of open budget tools and sort of visualizations in order to help citizens sort of understand what the budget is going into. And also anecdotally, I've heard about the pains of responding to public records requests related to the budget in the past, and how much time and effort that can take a city and a city staff to respond to. So there's been a lot of effort to try and make these things more available to the public. But as a business looking to sell into government, it's also incredibly valuable information to be able to download a budget and find out what's in there for the coming year and what they've been doing in the past. Tons of great information there. And one other thing here is Kelly mentioned revenue stability. I'll just say the stability of this market overall is one of its key features and something that is worth calling out. It's very unlike the private sector in that sense. It is incredibly stable. And so just something to think about in all aspects of selling to this government, to the market. It is very, very stable.
Okay, so I talked earlier about the budget telling a story. It really, really does. If you look at I'm trying to think of a large, well-run government. I mean, if you looked at use San Diego yesterday, John, if you looked at the city of San Diego's budget, and I have not looked at it in 10 years, but I promise you it would tell you the story of San Diego. It would tell you where they've been, where they are, and where they're going in a very quantifiable way. And I'm going to skip down to the third budget here, the third bullet here, the annual comprehensive financial report. That's essentially a public sector's audit, their year-end audit report that's done by an outside auditor. That, along with the budget, now that tells the story. Of course, you're looking at the results for the year, but with the notes in that report, with the management summary, which can be 20 pages long, you really know the whole picture of where they're going, where they've been. And they're two very useful tools. And again, when I was in an analyst role, that ACFR was a key document for us. But again, I could look at that in the budget, and I could essentially know where the credit rating was going to land for that municipality without talking to a soul. Now, look, they love taking us out in helicopters and driving us around their cities and taking us out to dinner. None of it tended to matter. Those two documents tell their story. And again, I talked about the strategic plan. In the last couple of days, I pulled up a few strategic plans for some large cities. I looked at Brownsville, Texas, and I looked at Park City, Utah. They just came up in a search that I did. And looking at those documents, you can see projects that the city council has, or the county commission has publicly stated in a published document that they intend to accomplish. Yet they don't know what, they don't know for how much, they don't know how they're going to pay for it, but they're committing, or they're attempting to commit to their community to build that whatever they're going to build, or develop that whatever they're going to develop. So it's a document that I think is full of information that can begin conversations with governments who may not even know how to get those conversations started, but they're telling you they want to do it in those documents. And then this last point, I think this is important, and I thought of this from the call a couple of days ago. Governments are not supposed to be in the business of making money, right? They're supposed to spend the money that they receive on projects and operations that benefit the folks who pay it, that benefit the public. With very few exceptions, they are spending every penny that they get in every year. So they don't tend to have a big slush fund for future anything set aside. They do maintain fund balances, and those are savings accounts, but they really need to maintain those. They're not necessarily saving up for a big project. They are there for a fiscal emergency, and those sorts of cushions are required for their for their fiscal health. So I just think it's important. They're not in the business of making money. They don't have a lot of extra money laying around. They spend what they get in.
The human element of that piece, that they're not in the business of making money, that they're going to spend what comes in, is important in conversations with the with local governments. I have seen people selling who are used to being in, do more work in the private sector and don't necessarily know that you can be really frank and forthright about budget money in the public sector, because one, it's public, and two, they're going to spend it. So you can ask very specifically, how much budget do you have? And most of the time they're just going to tell you, and they're not going to tell you to try and get a better deal or a squeeze on a deal. That is rare, because the money's the money. They're going to spend it. They know what they're going to spend it on. Are they going to want to try and do more maybe with it? Maybe. But for the most part, there's a lot of transparency, more so than you see in the private sector, where there might be a little bit more of a haggle going on. There's no real incentive, or a much lessened incentive, to do that in the public sector. And it's one of the things that I think can really set you apart, is also having that same level of transparency on your end, right? And explaining everything, just being incredibly forthright, again, more so than you would be in the private sector, because the incentives for purchasing are a little bit different. So just a thing to keep in mind there.
So opportunities and constraints. So I talked about the revenue. It does tend to be very predictable. When there are recessionary challenges, they're real for governments, and that's the reason why they maintain those balances for a rainy day, so to speak. And governments, to a large extent, they're limited in their ability to raise more money. Most states and localities have limitations on how much they could raise property taxes, for example. I mean, property taxes are by far the largest funding source for local government operations. And again, not to get in the weeds, but in a very simple way, property tax revenue is generated from a property tax rate and the value of structures within that municipality. So those are always rising. So that even though you're not raising property tax rates, that revenue tends to go up annually for a locality, and then they can raise the rate. That's incredibly challenging politically, I would say. And I'll give you a good example. City of Tampa, right? I happen to live here, and I'm very familiar with their fiscal situation. The city of Tampa, like most major cities in the United States, have a structure of government called a mayor-council form of government. That's sort of an important distinction, and I think it's important for you to understand, because that form of government, which is, I'd say, 80% of large governments in the United States operate this way. So the mayor is elected, and the mayor is the head of the government. The mayor is the head manager of the government, is the head of the government. That mayor, again, could be the most astute fiscal and public sector professional, or that mayor could be, the best, arborist in the world. It doesn't matter. They're elected, yet they're the head of the government making these decisions. And then you have sort of the executive board in the city of Tampa, for example, which is the city council. And the city council works as sort of a legislative body for the mayor. But again, the mayor's making the decision. Another form of government, or a different one that's, I think, very common, it's called the council manager form of government. And there's a city council, again, the elected officials, and they hire a manager, often called a city manager. On the county level, could be called a county commissioner. And then that's always a professional, well-educated in the public sector, who is the executive of the government. And their role is to carry out the policies that the city council brings forth. And in the strong mayor example I gave in Tampa, we currently have a mayor. She had been the police chief. I think she's pretty wise in the public sector, but she's a politician, and she has projects that she wants to complete, and she want to get reelected. So she actually this year proposed a property tax increase, and it was a meaningful property tax increase. And it was sort of I'm like a policy geek, but I found it fascinating to be involved and just to see the dialogue between the mayor, the city council, and the community. And ultimately, the city council, they had to approve it by, I think, by a more than a majority, and they didn't. And I will tell you, in that case, there were hundreds of citizens that came out, and I believe that that's a case where they influenced the city council to not approve it. And lo and behold, government still opened up the next day, lo and behold, and, without the additional revenue from that, from those tax dollars. But when a mayor's doing this, when a city council's voting on this, you have to remember they're elected officials. Yes. Are they there to be stewards of public resources? Yes. Are they there because they're altruistic and they want to see the best for a community? Maybe. I mean, they're elected officials. But from where I stand, I often think their ultimate goal often is to get reelected, right? So it's important to keep, I think, that sort of nuance in mind when you're looking at a project. When you're looking at it, just sort of how they fund a budget, what projects different elected officials support that may be very different from what a professional manager will support. So I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of elected officials go a long, long way to garner the public support of a public safety union, for example. Those sorts of groups are just incredibly influential when it comes to elections.
You mentioned, I think you're probably right on with it, but you said roughly 80% of large cities have the strong mayor council form of government. Is there a sort of population cutoff, you think, where it's kind of like if you can make a general assumption, if the population, say 250 and greater, they probably have a strong mayor or something like that, or is it a little less tangible?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, but thinking sort of anecdotally, I think that the cities with greater populations do tend are more likely to have. I mean, they're the cities that you think of as more political, right? Like New York City, Chicago. I would guess that you're right. And then it's also a little bit regional. I think California, for example, there are some exceptions. I mean, there's an exceptionally strong culture of excellent city management in California. So there's some large cities in California that are surprisingly council manager forms of government. So I think it can go either way, but I think generally you're right. I mean, you're Chicago, you're Houston, you're Dallas, all of those. And a mayor council government, it's not a bad form of government. They're by nature, they're more complex, and you just don't know who that mayor is. And certainly they want to get reelected. You might have a little luck if they're termed out, but otherwise, motivations could be all over the place.
And again, just on the trying to tie in a little bit with the go-to-market piece here and how that fits is when you have that form of government, you're in a large area, you will see very clearly what agenda items are going to be pushed out, right? Because you will see the mayor's initiatives for that year or their strategy. And it can be helpful to start figuring out how does your solution that you are selling to this potential client or group of clients, how does it tie in? Is there a message we can create that fits within this agenda that I'm reading in the newspaper or on their website? And that extends beyond just the strong mayor council. You can see that in council managers. There's still the council, still elected officials. But it's an important thing to keep your eye on.
On this slide, it's important to remember that their revenues, while they're consistent and reliable generally, not a whole lot of flexibility to raise it. That might beg the question, well, how do you incorporate a new project? And are you bumping somebody out, or are you finding some other way to fund it? Most governments, I'd say, certainly from medium to large governments, they're going to have an Office of Intergovernmental Relations. I mean, that office, one of the primary responsibilities of folks who work in that office is to explore grant opportunities, for example. So if there's a project where there's the government, they just don't have additional revenues to fund something. If there's a grant out there, they may or may not know about it. I mean, it's not someone's full-time job to do that, I'd imagine, but the Office of Intergovernmental Relations can be, I think, a useful connection point to look at opportunities like that. And it's just another way to look at a way to find money to fund something that may not exist in the existing structure of the government.
And I'm going to throw something else here for the local governments on the ground who maybe see, I mean, there may be like 20 different grants that they're looking at, trying to understand what uses are applicable, how to apply for a grant fund, who to apply for, what they need to know, what are all the stringent rules and regulations they have to follow in order to make those funds available and to actually use those funds can be very, very complicated. So if you are able, as a private organization, to come in and help sort that out and provide the message that, hey, we know how this works. You don't have to go sift through a really crowded, maybe not super helpful state webpage about this grant program and follow broken links back to the federal government's recommendations and so forth. We can be your one-stop shop, and we'll tell you in a much more concise, easy to understand way how to get access to these funds. That's an invaluable resource to local governments.
It's not always obvious what the form of government is, honestly, if you're looking at the two documents that I believe are very informative about a government, the budget and the financial report. It's not always obvious, but you can probably get a sense from looking at those. But I do think that it's important to know for entities that you're, exploring opportunities with, because it changes the dynamic of how decisions are made and what the process looks like to make those decisions in budget development, and then also in sort of, advantageous sort of connections to make within the government.
Mm-hmm. Something that I think everybody's probably realizing as you've spoken. So I'll just say it very explicitly, which is that there is often some tension between professional municipal staff. Same deal with school districts, same deal with special districts. The professionals who often have years of training, they maybe even went to school to understand how do you run a city, how do you run a school, what are the operations like. There can be tension between them and the elected officials. It's something you do not, as a vendor, want to be involved in. You want to do everything you can to steer clear of it. I have been caught up in it once or twice, and it never did it. It was never a good thing. And it's important to know that tension can exist. It doesn't all the time. There are plenty of places where there'll be a great relationship between the elected official, the council and the city management or the finance officers or whatever. But it's important to know that tension can exist, and you don't want to accidentally find yourself in the middle of it. And so that's why it's important to know that politics does exist at this level of government and to be aware of it. I'll say this, this is something I'll say throughout the program, which is local government is really the only government where people come in on a regular basis to their meetings and yell at them, right, for what they're doing. They literally, will get a busload. I have seen a busload of people, multiple busloads of people come in to a meeting where you're trying to do business, and that's their right. I'm glad they can do that, but it happens, and it can impact how things work in a local government level. Local government is closest to the people, and it has a real direct impact. So it's important to be aware of those situations and do your best not to get in them at all. As an outside vendor, you don't want to be part of it, but you need to be aware these are things that can happen, and they can influence a government and how government spends and buys and makes decisions.